Good morning, everyone. Or if you're on the other side of the world, good morning. Uh, I'm about to go live with Dr. Joshua Schiffer from Fred Hutch. I called him Adam Schiffer because, I really want to know what's happening with the NFL other than canceling all the preseason games. Oh, what is this? Yes, this is a gin vodka spritzer that I like to have at about 11 every morning. So we're going to talk about COVID, and because Joshua Schiffer is like one of the top researchers of COVID at Fred Hutch in Seattle, my hometown. So when he logs on here, I will have about 600 questions for him because he's way smarter than me. And I'm going to look at these requests here, and there they go. There's Fred Hutch. There we go. Good doctor in, and he's going to tell me what's going on with my hair this morning and where I got this amazing mug. Can I pay? Oh, hi, doctor.
Hey, Joel.
What's happening?
Not much. How are you?
I am well. It's been a little while.
Yeah, how you been?
I'm well. I haven't been paddling out on the Puget Sound like I assume you have been. So I'm pretty jealous.
Yeah. It's the only good thing about 2020 so far has been we've had a nice summer here. No fires,
Hey,
it's clean. So I'll take it.
it's the little things.
It's the little things, yeah.
I have so many questions for you. I know you have a ton for me. How is it talking to Russell Wilson? How is his new cleat coming out by Nike? When's Sierra going to give birth? I know you have all those questions, doctor, but I think we have to talk about COVID.
Okay. Hopefully we'll get to them at the end.
Are you a Seattle sports fan?
I'm a
That's
Ravens.
no.
I'm a Ravens fan. I'm a Sounders fan. So it really is sports specific. And if we get a basketball team and a hockey team, then I will support those teams. But
Okay.
the Seahawks are fine. It's far enough away from Baltimore that it's rare that I have to worry about the two teams playing each other. But
That's true.
yeah.
I also like the Ravens named after a poem. I like that name.
Yeah.
And see if this changes anything. Oh, this is way better. Well, should we dive right into it?
Yeah.
It's been a little bit, and from my uneducated assessment, we're at 4 million cases almost today and 143,000 deaths just in America. And, I want to talk about the science here very soon, but I guess I would love to have like a 1 or 2 minute overall assessment from you of how do you think it's going here in this country with the pandemic.
Yeah, it's obviously a distressing situation. It's not good at all. There are numerous states where there's exponential growth in cases. The difference between, if you want to call this the second wave that's sort of built upon the first wave that never ended, is that most of these cases are in a younger population.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're starting to see in Florida and Texas and Arizona, quite predictably, is that the infection is not staying in that population, and we're starting to see growth in the higher risk, older age cohorts. And so it's really been a very disappointing summer. The only the good news around the globe is that Europe appears to be doing very well. The northeast of the United States, the areas that were hit the hardest, appear to be doing very well as far as having a much lower number of cases. And so there's this really strange situation where, for example, if you want to fly from Washington to New York, you have to self-quarantine for 2 weeks, sort of like you'd be going to a foreign country where they're quarantined.
Yeah.
And so it's not good at all. And it just, I honestly didn't think this was going to happen. And unfortunately, I think we're soon going to be seeing a spike in deaths in many states, and it's just going to be a very sad time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. And when you say, I mean, I want to get to some of the bigger topics, but when you said, like right now, if we fly to New York, we have to self-quarantine. If there's, how do they enforce that? Is there, they don't do it the same way that British Columbia or Canada's doing it, which is they check on you, and if you leave um, where you're staying, you get arrested or you get fined. That doesn't happen. That's not happening on the East Coast, is it?
I actually don't know. I don't know what the structure of that policy is. I I don't know. I don't know how much teeth that whether there's really any enforcement behind it or not. I've just read about it in the lay press like everybody else. I mean, it's the whole thing about the way the virus spreads is it's kind of law of averages. So there, it really there's some threshold in terms of the majority of the people who would be traveling between two places are not infected and are not a risk, and the so if the policy were effective enough to keep 80 or 90% of the people who are traveling honest and segregated from the rest of the population, it should probably work. But I don't know how it's being tracked and how it's being
Right.
enforced at all.
You don't even hear any of that. I feel, I mean, as I said, 4 million cases, or we're just about to reach that. And, Europe is having less than 4,000 cases a day now.
Right.
And last week, Florida had 17,000 cases in one day.
Right.
So what, I mean, I've got there's a lot of kind of obvious answers of what's going on, but I feel like, but what do you think the problem is?
I think there are two things. The first is that the difference between being in a situation where this effective reproductive number is less than one and being greater than one, it's averaged across the population, and it's all of our behaviors averaged across the population.
Right.
And it only takes a small difference to really, there's this threshold at which you're either undergoing exponential growth or you're not. So I've not really left the state, but I suspect that if you were to fly to the Northeast and observed how people were behaving, it would be probably difficult to discern from here where we're having outbreaks. And it really gets to this point of it's really everybody's decisions that they're making collectively, whether to wear a mask, whether to go to a restaurant or not, averaged over everybody. And if you can just get to that tipping point where enough people are doing the right thing, then you can really be well positioned. The second thing, and this is just so frustrating that this hasn't been sort of widely disseminated to the public, is that in order to make your life easier from an infection control standpoint, you have to get the number of cases down.
Right.
So and once you're beyond a certain point, and we're well beyond that point now, the number of strategies that you have goes down dramatically, and really what's left is widespread social distancing. So any of the debates that you want to have about the specific issues we're facing in the fall, most prominently schools, but also how to get people back to work, none of this stuff works if you have thousands of new cases per day. You need to be in a situation where New York's going to have small focal outbreaks, and it could be worse, I don't know, but at least they're in a situation where tracking cases and doing case tracking is theoretically possible. Once you hit a tipping point where there are hundreds of cases per day in the city, there's just no way to track all of the cases, track all of the contacts. And so the remaining answer is this brute force approach. And in the long term, it's bad for everything. It's bad for the economy. So
Right.
for those who argue that shutdowns are not the answer because they're terrible for the economy, the point is to avoid the shutdown in the first place. And nobody's quite saying this out loud because it's just politically an untouchable issue, but that's where we're heading, right? I mean, I don't
Right.
understand how, and you know, in a perfect world, we would shut down today. Honestly, there's not, it's far better to shut down before the ICUs are overflowing and before the emergency departments are overflowing. The signals are in the data already, but they're not sort of emotional signals. They're just case numbers. They're not deaths. They're not filled ICU beds. And so, politically, it's very hard to act on where we are. But the fact is, in our state, we're having more cases per day than we ever did when things were most intense.
Right.
So it's really not a good situation at all.
No, I couldn't agree. And I've heard people say, hey, we already shut down, and so we have to open. But I feel like each state had a different version of shutting down. And there wasn't a unified shutdown the way that Europe kind of did it. And that's why Europe has, and South Korea have so fewer cases, because they actually clamped down, and people
Right.
were not allowed to even go for a run or a jog. And I know it's brutal, and but I don't. You help me here. I don't see how this gets better. How it's going along, which is this. Some states are more shut down than others. I'm worried that this is just going to go on for months. I mean, and this obviously, unless there's a more brutal shutdown to really knock it down, as you said, stop the hundreds of cases a day. Is there any alternative? I can't see it.
I don't see it, but what I do, the missed opportunity from a policy standpoint is consistent messaging. Because one of the things we have learned very clearly is that you don't need to abandon your life, right?
Right.
I mean, there's no reason whatsoever to avoid going to a park, to avoid jogging. I mean, that all of the measures that are that draconian aren't going to help anybody. They're terrible for, people's mental health.
Yeah.
And, the truth is, going to a park, the risk of infection, unless you're really trying to get infected, is very, very low. And
Right.
so there are all sorts of things that you can do. You can support your favorite restaurant, just don't eat there. Pick up the food and take it home. You can see your friends, just see them outside and socially distance. So it's a little bit disappointing in the sense that where we are scientifically does not require people to abandon their lives. It just requires what are, in my view, actually pretty small sacrifices to get us to a place where we are safer to enjoy the things that were, once a part of our life. Even then, it'll be at 50%. But, the school thing we should talk about, but to me, it's the most difficult policy decision that needs to be made. And I'm on the fence about it, and I sort of change my mind every day. But at the moment, it's not a policy decision at all. You can't send kids back to school when the infection is wildly out of control in the population. That will result in a small number of dead children, and it will result in teachers getting infected, many of whom have risk factors for severe disease, and it will bring the infection home. And so if you even want to talk about things like that, you need to get the caseload to a much lower place. And so to get back to all of these things that we like in our life, both recreational but also functional, like school, we just need to get the caseload down quickly. And I think we can get the caseload down without locking ourselves at home all day. It's just making basic small sacrifices.
Wear a mask. It's wearing a mask and socially distancing is what it would knock it down.
Right. But a definition of social distancing that's much more refined and permissive than it was 3 months ago. Yeah. Right. It seems like years ago, but when this all started in Wuhan, you couldn't leave your house. You couldn't go to the supermarket without permission. And at the time, I think a lot of us in the field were thinking, yeah, that's about right. We're not sure how this works. We don't know much about the fatality rate. We don't know much about the method of spread. We don't know if you can get it outside. But I think we feel a lot safer making these conclusions now that, again, people don't need to abandon their lives. They just need to make certain
Yeah.
small sacrifices. And
So, but I want to talk about schools, but before that, because I read a lot of stuff about masks, and some people are like, there's a movement that says cloth masks don't work. It has to be N95. What is your opinion on that? Or N95 or better?
So this gets to the issue of how the virus spreads and whether it spreads via aerosolization. And there are a couple of things about the virus that suggest that it can spread via aerosolization. The first are these numerous across the globe so-called super spreader events. And that really suggests that one person can infect a large number of people inside in a closed space probably with poor circulation and lots of people together.
Right.
And that is not a feature of viruses that spread via droplet exclusively. Influenza doesn't tend to have these super spreader events. And so that people then carry that argument forward and say, well, if you're really concerned about aerosols, then N95s are the way to go. But in my view, all of these arguments are not black and white. It's all shades of gray. I think that the evidence is increasingly suggesting that the virus can spread via both droplet and aerosol, and that wearing a mask, none of these masks, and N95 is not perfect for reasons I can get into in a second, but wearing an imperfect mask that's not fully protective, all of these things, again, when averaged across the population, I mean, even if a mask only protects 20 or 30%, so in other words, the person wearing it might not be that protected, right? Or the person wearing it is protecting other people if they happen to be infected, but that's also imperfect. Even if these things are not perfect at the individual level, when averaged across the population, they can have huge effects. Because again, they might be that single factor that gets the reproductive number from 1.2 to 0.9. And that's enough. That's enough to get the cases to start to go in the right direction. And so it really is, the mask wearing really is something that you're doing at a very small level for yourself, but much more so for your family and for the people in your life who you come into contact with. And then most importantly, for people you don't know, who are 2 or 3 contacts away, who might have been infected were you not wearing a mask. So I'm of the opinion that no mask is perfect, but that cumulatively, if worn by everybody, there's very good evidence that they're helpful.
Okay.
So the N95s would be better, theoretically, would be a much better approach if everyone walked around with N95s. But I don't think very many people have actually worn an N95. I mean, it's not wearing a cloth mask or wearing a hospital mask. I don't love when my glasses fog up and it's mildly uncomfortable, but wearing an N95 for an hour, it's really uncomfortable. So I don't think that there are very many people who would wear an N95 in public and be fully compliant with it. And if they're not fully compliant with it, then it's not much better than not wearing a mask at all. And so it's not a simple trade-off. I mean, if I'm going into a hospital room with somebody with active tuberculosis or active COVID, and I know they're shedding at very high levels, then certainly an N95 makes me feel better. But I'm wearing it for all of 5 minutes, not 2 hours.
Okay.
So the N95 worn in public is not really practical when 30% of our population is sort of moaning and groaning about wearing a mask at all. The N95 is not.
What would you wear on a plane if you had to fly?
I would wear probably a hospital mask. It's a good question. I mean, I do have an N95 in my trunk that I I've never worn anywhere that, I had from work, and whether I would wear that on a long flight is a good question. I think, as we've talked about before, I really, the stronger recommendation is not to fly anywhere unless you actually absolutely have to. I think that's
Right.
the first step. But really, yeah, I think I would probably base the decision on what the level of circulating infection is. You know, I it's I
If you were
don't
to, okay.
yeah, I don't know if there are official recommendations on this or not. There's if there are, they're certainly not grounded in very hard data. But if I were flying between here and Arizona tomorrow, uh, reasonably short flight, maybe I would do it. But I don't know. The other thing I would research before I went into that is what the availability of N95s is, more broadly speaking, because I would hate to use an N95 in the case where there's a shortage,
Right.
across the country. And I know that's been the case in the past, but I'm not up to date on what the supply chain situation is.
Would you wear a face mask on a flight?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah. Can you get it through your eyes, as you talked about? If like with these super spreader events, do you think that's how you can get infected?
I don't know if there's good data on whether you can get infected through the eyes, and whether that's a common mechanism of infection. It probably, it's a mucosal surface, meaning that there's cells that allow replication of viruses at the surface, whereas wet, whereas skin cells are generally protected from infection a bit more because there's this layer of dead cells on top of the live cells below, which can harbor a virus. So it wouldn't surprise me if the virus can replicate in the eye. There are not any well-described eye manifestations of the disease. So with certain cold viruses, one called adenovirus, people often get pink eye or conjunctivitis, whereas that doesn't appear to be the case with SARS-CoV-2. So I'm not sure. I don't think it's the predominant method to get infected. But if
Okay.
I were on a plane, I would be in that sort of hospital mode where I don't touch myself at all. That's become second nature to me over the years, working in a hospital where I'm sort of hands off any part of my body while I'm there.
Right.
So I'd like to think that I would be in that mode of really being careful and washing my hands probably 10 times more than I needed to during the flight.
It's a good time to be a hypochondriac on a plane.
It's not a bad time to be a hypochondriac. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to get to the schools thing, but I also want to talk about antibodies and the possibility, or what the data right now is on reinfection. If you have the antibodies, what is the research tending towards? That if you get the antibodies, it looks like you're not going to get it again? Or is there a possibility you lose them? Does it depend how infected you got before? Whatever you got, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, you bet. So let's start with reinfection first, because it's very predictable that over the next few months, and it's already started, there are going to be lots of reports of reinfection that are not well validated, that are simply lack any degree of evidence to be called reinfection. And I'm seeing this already. And unfortunately, I'm seeing it associated with very dramatic headlines that are, it's just really misleading. I have yet to see a single report in the literature of reinfection. And the problem with reinfection is that it really is going to require a very careful research protocol to identify it, because to truly identify reinfection, you need to have a sample of the virus from the first infection and a sample of the virus from the second infection. And if they're separated by many months, then what you would need to do is show that they're genetically different, that there's no way they're related. And then you've proven reinfection. What I'm seeing a lot of in the literature is, yeah, from physicians who might not be infectious disease trained, and so they're just sort of reporting what they're seeing. Yeah, I had a patient who had COVID 4 months ago. They were really sick, and now they're coming back to me, and they're really sick, and I retested them, and they're still positive. That doesn't imply reinfection at all. And in fact, we know that many people shed the virus at very low levels for months. And that person could be sick for any number of reasons, including, sort of immune phenomena related to COVID. They could just still feel pretty lousy as a result of their first COVID infection. But that is not
Right.
evidence of reinfection. And similarly, it's not even close. I mean, the experiment I described of sequencing the virus really requires, having a sophisticated lab and this really sophisticated research structure to prove that. But at least you could get viral loads, right? At least you could say, yeah, the second time we checked this person, their viral load was really, really high. That would, to me, at least be suggestive of reinfection rather than just continual low-level shedding. And so this is just an area that I foresee a lot of misleading work. I've been thinking a lot about how best to prove this, and I personally think the best way to do it will be in the environments where infection was so prevalent during the first round. And really, to me, the highest prevalence I've seen of infection has been in the prison system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's some prisons that have had 90% of inmates infected, and the meatpacking plants as well.
Jeez.
And so that would be a place where, I really hope that they're taking infection control precautions, but it's obviously a challenging environment to prevent reinfection. And so and conducting biomedical research in the prison system is extraordinarily challenging. But if you wanted to get the answer, you wouldn't just want a case report from a doctor in an office saying, yeah, I think I'm seeing reinfection. You would want to show that, yeah, we had this prison where 90% of people were infected. And when we looked again, when a bunch of inmates had symptoms, we detected the virus, and it's a totally different virus. Then it would become a real concern. So the nitty gritty of how to design that research study is critical. So
Right.
that's reinfection. Now, underlying this is the theoretical concern of, can reinfection occur? And the importance of reinfection would be, it would not be great news if people could sequentially get a severe infection and then get a severe infection 4 months later. That would be bad news for a vaccine, because generally speaking, natural infection induces immunity as well or better than a vaccine. So we're hoping that's not the case. And I personally think it's unlikely to be the case. What could certainly occur is people get reinfected, and the second time they're sicker for a shorter period of time, less severe, and a less prolonged duration of viral shedding, so that they're contagious for a shorter period of time. And the reason there is some concern about this is there is really now a huge amount of emerging data that suggests that not everybody who gets infected generates a permanent antibody response. So people will, and what antibodies are they're proteins that are produced by two types of cells. One is called a memory B cell, and one is called a plasma cell. And those cells produce this antibody like factories just all day long. And the antibody has the capability to bind a virus and prevent it from infecting a cell, or to bind an infected cell to make that cell a target to get killed by another type of cell. And so the fact that the antibodies don't persist in everybody is somewhat worrisome, in the sense that it denotes that maybe the second time around the person wouldn't recognize the infection. What has been seen as a general trend is that people who have asymptomatic infection or mild infection are more likely to generate an antibody response and then lose it, relative to people who have severe infection, which to me is very intuitive, that a more inflammatory, intense infection would generate a more permanent immune response.
And is that how MERS worked as well?
I I should check on that. I'm just trying to jar my memory here. I know that with SARS-CoV-1, some people lost antibodies, which was surprising because that was really a hot infection. But with
Hmm.
MERS, I think with MERS, most people generated a sustained antibody response. But
Okay.
don't quote me on that because I'm trying to remember the paper and I can't totally remember. But here's the thing, about the antibody response is the lack of a permanent antibody response does not mean that there's no immunologic memory. There's a completely separate arm of the immune response called the T cell response, and those are cells which are programmed to recognize infected cells specifically so you have different clones of T cells that recognize different proteins that are specific for virus X, virus Y, and then can
Mm-hmm.
rapidly kill infected cells. And really, to nobody's surprise, it looks like almost everybody who gets infected generates a memory T cell response that appears to be sustained over many months. And the important feature of that T cell response is it's not independent of the antibody response. So the T cell response helps promote an antibody response. And so it's very possible that somebody who gets reinfected who does not have the antibodies would generate antibodies more quickly the second time around. And it's also really important to know that the T cells themselves might have great efficacy in terms of eliminating infection more quickly. So I personally would, if I had to make a uneducated prediction about the future, I suspect we will see reinfection. I suspect that severe reinfection, at least within the first year of getting infected, will be unlikely, and that this immune memory, will really be helpful. I don't think it's going to be terribly common either, but this is all conjecture based on other infections, and
Right.
we'll have to see to really figure this out.
Yeah, yeah, from what you're saying, it sounds like there's still so much unknown about this,
Right.
especially about reinfection. And I'm going to bring up a topic before we get to schools because I want to talk about that. But when I hear people say, well, there's more cases in America because we test more, I feel like I don't know why people are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, sure, we test a lot of folks, so there are a lot of cases. But whether we tested 1,000 people or 5 million, the testing would show what the infection rate would be across what the overall infection rate is, and the infection rate in America is going up. It is not going down. We could use that testing data, whether it was a 5 million or 1,000, but you could see whether the virus was infecting more people. And right now, the infection rate is definitely going up, as I said. And so, can you talk to that?
Yeah, the people who are making that argument are either policymakers who are trying to cherry pick the data to make the situation look less grave than it actually is, or they're people who just kind of are in denial about where we are. One of the metrics that is often used to try to adjust for that, because there is a phenomenon of testing increasing over time as scalability goes up, but also testing going down at some point when the system gets flooded, as we've seen recently in Arizona, where people are waiting for hours in their car to get tested. The way to account for that on a day-to-day basis is just to look at the percent of the tests that are coming back positive. And that number has clearly gone up. And then
Right.
At a more sophisticated level, the mathematical models that look at the trends of infection over time account for these uncertainties when they're being fit to data. And so it really is pure denial that that the reality is that we're not having more cases.
Right. And I feel like if you look at, yeah, for folks that hear that argument, it's like, just think about what the infection rate is, or just see what that number is. And it was going down, was it not, in April? Like it was heading down I feel like it was April, or now it seems like 5 years ago, but it's been trending up over the last 2 months.
Right. There were these very clever graphs done where they would show the data and the number of cases were going down. But then when New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut were excluded, the cases were never going down, that they had just plateaued.
Wow.
And so really in the rest of the country, for a brief period of time, we had established an effective reproductive number at approximately 1, meaning that for every case we generated, we would, that it was essentially one person would generate on average 1 case.
Right.
And as, using analytics and looking at how frequently and far people were moving and how often they were getting in their cars, very predictably, as that went up, the effective reproductive number trickled up to greater than 1, and the cases started to grow exponentially. So,
right.
And the other, just to add a point, I'm sorry you didn't directly ask this, but it's just the same group of people is making the argument that we're not seeing deaths, and I just want to touch on that, if that's okay.
Please, yes.
Because the explanation for that, there are a bunch of explanations, and what I'll do is I'll go through them from most likely to maybe, but the most likely explanation is that the deaths simply lag behind the cases. That it takes somebody on average 3 weeks to die from COVID, and so it's not at all surprising that we would see a bump in infections without seeing a bump in deaths. And I fully expect that we are going to see first a bump in hospitalizations, which is already happening in many states.
Right.
And then soon followed by a bump in deaths. So that is a bogus and dangerous argument. The second feature, which is are in the young. And so we would expect a lower fatality rate in the young. But as I mentioned before, there is slowly this trickle of cases from the 20 to 30-year-old cohort into the 50 to 60-year-old and greater than 60-year-old cohort.
Right.
But those two features are definitely in play. There has been some really interesting speculation on whether the overall severity of infections might be going down based on mask wearing and based on the fact that maybe a mask doesn't prevent all infections, but if somebody with a mask transmits to somebody else, maybe they do so at a lower viral load. And so that person gets infected and they're less likely to have severe infection. That is very, very speculative. It's interesting, but it's not something to sort of hang your hat on policy-wise. And I don't think it will be enough to decrease the subsequent spike in deaths. And we'll really only be able to diagnose something like that after the fact, not beforehand. And, so those are really the things that are being tossed around. But really the key point is that the reason we're not seeing deaths yet is simply a lag phenomenon.
Right. So now let's move to your favorite topic, school opening, where you have already said earlier in this conversation that you kind of switch each day about how you feel about it. And so please, I can talk about it, but you are a lot more educated about it, because I'll just say on my uneducated opinion of it is that I don't know how, if you send kids back to school, obviously right now, if there has to be so many plans in place, from ventilation in the school to how does it work for kids to get to school? How does the testing work for kids? Are they wearing masks? And you already talked about it. If you have teachers that are older, teachers with immune compromised, then the kids go home, and obviously you've got kids that they're kids, and if they're elementary school, how does recess look? How are the kids interacting with each other? There's so many questions about it, and that I don't there may be a zillion plans in place that I have not read, but how do you feel about it? And I would love to hear your opinion.
Right. So the first thing, I guess, just starting with the data, it looks that sort of teenage cohort, middle and high schoolers, are really no different from adults as far as likelihood of getting infected and likelihood of infecting other people. Whereas the elementary school kids look to be a little less likely to get infected. I'm a little less swayed by the arguments that are being made that they're less likely to transmit. There's some beautiful data from South Korea, and I feel like every time we're on this podcast, I want to tip my hat to the South Korean Public Health Service and research enterprise, because they're just generating such beautiful data. But it looks like kids shed at extremely high viral loads, very similar to adults, in that elementary school cohort. So I find it hard to believe that they're not effective transmitters once they get infected. But there is some argument that you might treat those two populations differently. And I have no opinion on that, but I just want to mention that that's out there. But here's, if I had a wish list for the schools, it would be simple. It would be that there would be a unified national policy rather than everyone trying to figure this out on their own.
Right.
And that policy would be based on opening the schools carefully with strict procedures about how to social distance, about how to keep kids safe, about how to stagger classes, and whatever else you might do to really make the environment safe. But that the criteria for doing so would be very well established. And I think those criteria are pretty straightforward. That first of all, you need to have the effective reproductive number less than 1. You should,
right.
It's simply not safe to open the schools in a situation where, and our group has been involved in modeling this, there is a scenario where opening the schools is the thing that pushes you over the threshold from barely okay to dangerous situation. And I'm not just talking about for the schools, but at the entire population level, where the schools provide enough extra transmission that it really is the trigger that sets things over the edge. And so you really want to be in a safety zone with an effective reproductive number less than 1, first of all. And second of all, so keeping in mind that effective reproductive number affects the number of cases that a person passes on. But the second thing you need under control, irrespective of that, is simply the number of cases. So the number of new cases per day in a city needs to be below a certain level per capita to do this safely. So and it just would be so helpful if those criteria were set in stone. And then, every city in the country would be saying, okay, we have got to meet these benchmarks by September to avoid having angry, upset constituents. And so we would all be targeting these things, and it would really help focus our public health goals. I've been, as depressed as I've been about our reaction to this infection, it's been really heartening to see so many local governments respond creatively and thoughtfully. But this is a situation where there needs to be a rational national mandate about how this is done, and based on very sound epidemiologic data. And I, in the absence of that, I fear it's going to be a mess, and I fear that there are going to be lives lost as a result of. The governor of Missouri, I don't know if you heard this, really just said, "Yeah, we're going to open the schools regardless," without any thought, and it was just so painful to hear, because I'm just thinking, another way to say that is we're willing to accept X number of deaths, just to do this, and we're not even going to think about it. And we're not. I just couldn't imagine being so crass and careless about a policy that literally involves people's lives. It's just so disappointing. So
I don't see how a child. So say, You all say if all those things were in place, somehow the effective reproductive number is below 1, the cases are down. If there were these benchmarks in place, I mean, this would all be great. Obviously, it would be tremendous, and there would be then there would be a plan. I still don't know how, if these schools open in September, if you have a perfectly healthy kid who catches it, and the kid is asymptomatic and goes home to their mom who might have had, I don't know, cancer and is over cancer, but that still means they're immune compromised. So that kid can infect their parent, and then we're off to the races with death or a bad infection. And I just don't know how. No, I feel like no one's really or talking about these. What are the next steps? Or if you do this, this is possible. This is most likely going to happen. Something like that. I mean, there's no plan in place for that.
Right. And,
It's
I
really,
think you could have like a really nice risk benefit argument about that if it were rare, right? So if this were something
right,
where we accept that this is going to happen, like, like fatal car accidents, they happen. We've
right.
decided as a society it's worth the risk. It's worth the risk that people like to get places and they like to be in their cars. But we're so beyond that. We're in a situation where if we open the schools with a lot of circulating cases and with exponential growth ongoing, it's not a question of whether we'll be contributing to mortality. We will be. And it's
Yes.
not going to be a random case here or there. And so, I want to be as gray, as ambivalent as I feel about this issue. I want to be in a situation where there's actually a debate about it, where it's a debatable issue. But at the moment, if in our state, if things are the way they are now in September, it's not a debate, unfortunately, and that's not where I want to be.
Would you send your kids to school in September?
If you had asked me 4 weeks ago, I would have said whatever the guidelines are, that's what we will do, because at some level, I just want to go along with the system, but it's getting increasingly difficult to say that. I mean, I can't imagine sending, just as a responsible thing to do, I can't imagine sending my kid to school if the situation's out of control, because I don't want to contribute to the problem. I'm not terribly worried, I'm not terribly worried about the health of my kids or even my own health. It's more just I don't want to contribute to the problem in any way.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, no, I just don't. I mean, and also personally, I just like how I don't, without a plan, I know that they're scrambling right now, but that stuff should have started 2 months ago.
right.
Because we're not hearing much, and maybe I'm missing it. But I usually don't miss stuff like that because I have kids in school. Okay, so
And I
I
really
guess
I want to make the point that I'm not at all trying to criticize school administrators or teachers
right.
here. I mean, I just don't feel like they're the ones who should be making these policies.
Right.
It
Well,
really,
they're not scientists studying the virus. I mean, they're teachers and they're administrators, and they need some cohesive plan from people that do things like this so they can implement it. So, like you said, all right, well, that was fun. So I want to talk briefly about because I know I've already taken almost an hour from you, but I want to talk about the vaccine situation that still is a long way off, but this Chinese company called Sinovac is in phase 3 now, which I think is further, correct me if I'm wrong, further ahead than like the Oxford Jenner and further ahead from I think about anybody. But so can you talk about that?
yeah, they are in phase 3. They're uh, there are really several vaccines that are showing promise, both in terms of generating sustained antibody responses, actually, above and beyond what we're seeing with infection, and then also generating T cell responses. So there are a lot of promising vaccines. The studies are really getting up and running, and will be, including the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, that will be moving to phase 3 in the fall. So it's very exciting work. I remain pretty optimistic that one or multiple of these products will work.
So with the amount of money that they're pouring into these vaccines and the number of people, obviously it's unprecedented. This has never happened
Yeah.
in our ever. And I know that the most optimistic projections for a vaccine are about February, or maybe it is even more optimistic than that. So if you could talk about that, and when these vaccines hit phase 3, how often is it, do they fail? Where they go like, we were so close, but we were actually wrong?
Yeah. So it depends on the virus. For HIV, the failure rate's been pretty high, but HIV is a uniquely challenging target. Whereas for things like measles and yellow fever, which are easier targets, I suspect that numerous approaches would work, but the first one worked, and so that's what happened. The FDA has set a target of 50% efficacy, meaning that at least 50% of people are protected. But there's subtlety there in the sense that I think it's pretty within the realm of possible outcomes that there's a lot of partial protection among people who still get infected.
Okay.
So that's the goal. The fact that there is a robust immune response generated against the virus is definitely a good sign. And for many vaccines, that's been predictive. But it's really hard to put a percentage on it. And I've seen enough vaccine trials fail that I won't feel completely confident about this until we have a product that works.
And you've seen them fail. You've seen them fail in phase 3.
Yeah.
Okay. And do you feel, but from what you were saying earlier, you're pretty optimistic about, there's so many people and so much money being poured into it that it seems inevitable. There seems going to probably be 3. Could there be 3 vaccines at once?
I think there could. I think that the production issues might necessitate that, and the geopolitical considerations of different countries competing for different markets with their vaccines could also come into play. One of the reasons that I gave you a vague answer is there's a fancy sort of statistical term called Bayesian logic, which people use for clinical trials, and I believe it to be true. And what it means is that as you start to do a number of clinical trials for a different target, the likelihood of success of your trial is often related to the success of all of the trials that have been done before, right? So with HIV medicines, let's say we have an HIV medicine that we know works, and some company develops a cousin of that medicine that has a very similar structure but is thought to have less side effects, so they want to bring it to market. When somebody does a trial to see whether or not that antiviral will work, like, we're 90% sure beforehand it's going to work because it's very similar to the one that hasn't worked. Similarly, for certain cancers, there's certain ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer have historically been really difficult targets for chemotherapy. And so the fact that you might have had 25 failed trials influences the likelihood that the next one will work. And so once we get one phase 3 study that shows efficacy, and maybe 2, or that don't show efficacy, I think that starts to shade people's opinions on what's possible. I would, I guess, be a little bit surprised if 2 of the vaccines are complete and utter failures and 2 are shining successes. And God, I could be completely wrong about this, but I would be a little bit more I think the more likely outcome is going to be that they cluster somehow, that they're, we might be looking at important differences between two vaccines, but that we can broadly say, oh, they both look like they work or they don't work.
Right. Okay. And what if you're a betting man, if they said to you, with all the information you have right now about them, because everyone's, obviously this is one of the things that everyone asks, when would you guess they could be available? If you're just guessing, I know that, again, it'll probably be vague, but as far as this goes, the only difference I think is the number of people and the amount of money. As far as this goes, what would you guess?
So, I got some email from this group at the University of, I think, Massachusetts, where they wanted to get a policy consensus on this. So they sent an email out to 1,000 experts or whatever and asked us to predict. And I think that the consensus was April, and that's just a bunch of people giving their educated guess as to when the first would be licensed. And so ready availability after that, I'm assuming, would be several months, with really trying to prioritize the people who are at greatest risk of both having severe infection if they get infected, but also people who might be transmitters. So essential workers, people in, I personally would go after the food industry. I think that's a vital sector of our economy, and those people have gotten hit so incredibly hard. But so.
Would you hit prisons as well first?
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, that population's been hit very hard, and there is, there are prisons where there's probably been zero infections. So it's really a question of, once it gets in, it spreads extremely rapidly. And so importantly, you're protecting the inmates, you're protecting the staff, and then you're protecting all of the people in that community if the staff bring the virus home. So yeah, I think that's a great target.
Yep. Okay. Well, doctor, I've taken an hour of your time when you could be actually working on this. I'm sorry. But I'm trying to think of any other, I mean, I could launch into a couple other subjects, but is there anything that you've been surprised by in the last month, that was unexpected? Or, I mean, obviously we've already talked about the infection rates going up and things like that, but is there anything novel that has surprised you about what's going on?
Yes, and if at the very end I could take a moment to plug something.
Yes.
No here. Yeah.
It's an energy drink. It's the Dr. Joshua Schiffer energy drink.
That's right. I'm moving on from this COVID thing to the
wow.
energy drink. Yeah.
I think that's really smart. You got to monetize this thing.
Right.
I mean, look at what Russell Wilson's done. It's a whole industry now for him.
Right. So what has surprised me in the last month? There's some very imperfect data from New York that suggests that in certain zip codes in certain regions of Queens, the rate of the seropositivity was north of 60%. And that really, I just did not see that coming. And it really does speak to this thing that we've now known for a few months, but it continues to surprise me, of the way that this virus really appears to spread. It just, in one community A looks just like community B, and community A gets hit extremely hard and community B gets spared. Here the comparison might be between Yakima and Wenatchee. Yakima just went through a very difficult time.
Yeah.
And Wenatchee did okay. Very similar demographic populations, but totally different. Same with the prisons, same with work environments. And so
and that's unexplainable, right? They can't figure out why, even though the behaviors of the people are very similar.
Yeah, I think it's this super spreader phenomena where there really are these events where a really big initiation event can take off, and the counter to that, which is mysterious, and actually our group is working on this quite a bit, is why most people who get this virus don't infect anybody. Not the case with flu. So with flu, most people who get infected infect somebody else. You know, over half of people who get influenza are thought to infect another person. But with SARS-CoV-2, the estimates are about 20%. And so there's this real dichotomy between people who don't infect anybody and infect a lot of people. And I am fascinated by that, and even though it's not necessarily new news, every time I hear about some niche population like this, I get really surprised. And
it's amazing. So,
yeah, and it's really important for all of us to understand who are doing research, because if we want to do clinical trials, we need to know to identify these populations and understand how it spreads. And we've just been thinking about this a lot for that reason.
and the super spreader event, it's a combination, obviously, of the environment that they put themselves in, the number of people, and of course, can a person themselves be just way more, just much more of a shedder than somebody else, a unique shedder of the virus?
So we don't know for sure. There's only really high quality shedding data on probably 100 people right now. My group has a very high bar for this because we follow viral loads are our thing. I've not seen a lot of evidence of this. Our modeling actually suggests that there's probably not something special about a super spreader. It's just wrong person, wrong time, wrong place. And that probably people are not contagious for very long. That the length, although people shed the virus for weeks and weeks sometimes, that they're probably only contagious for a few days during the early phases of disease. Unfortunately, often when they're pre-symptomatic. And so that really, I would suspect that the super spreading, that most people have the potential to be a super spreader, but they just don't show up at the wrong place at the wrong time. But time
makes
will
a lot
tell.
of sense.
Yeah.
And where can we get? You've brought up South Korea and that their data has been terrific. Where do you find that? Where could a person like me find that?
Yeah, it requires a little bit of. I guess one of the skill sets of our job is searching this thing called PubMed, which lists articles, and typing in the search terms is really helpful. But for there's a journal called Emerging Infectious Diseases, and for the Korean shedding data, they typically have been publishing in that journal in a really helpful format, and so that's where they've been publishing. But it's hard. There's so much data. I will say that the New York Times has done a really nice job with outlining progress. They had I would say a pretty good article on the state of antiviral therapies a couple of weeks back, and a very, very good article on vaccines this week, just going through what a phase 1 trial is, what a phase 2 trial is, what a phase 3 trial is, where each company is in terms of progress, and where the trials are being done. So the lay press is actually, particularly for people who don't have a deep scientific education, I feel like they've done a really nice job. And the Atlantic has really done a fantastic job as well in terms of essays describing many of the things we've talked about, as far as the increased infection rate and the death rate and progress on therapies and so forth.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go to I've been using some of those, but I'm going to go to this fun Emerging Infectious Diseases journal. That sounds like just a fun thing I can read as a family. Well, I've taken up a lot of your time, and I can't thank you enough. For those of you who are wondering what this is Dr. Joshua Schiffer from Fred Hutch, who is one of the leading researchers on COVID up in Seattle, my hometown. And we do this every couple of weeks, sometimes 3 weeks if I'm if I'm shooting a game show, but I would love to do this again soon. I could talk for hours, and it's extremely informative. So I'm going to post this on my Instagram, it'll be at Fred Hutch as well. But I can't thank you enough, Doctor. And boy, I hope we can have a distanced beer at some point. Maybe something from Georgetown Brewery.
That sounds fantastic. And Joel, I
That
just
would
want
be
to
great.
thank you. I've just gotten so much positive feedback about this, and really a lot of friends and family have told me how helpful it is. So I really appreciate your time doing it.
Wow.
It's been great.
Well, I just keep lobbing up questions for you to knock out. So, because I surely don't understand the science very well, other than what I read, and I can sound like I talk about it or know what I'm talking about, but you really do. So, I can't thank you enough. And so, wear a mask, folks, please, dear God, just wear a mask,
Please.
and this will be knocked down quite a bit. So, I'll see you hopefully in a week and a half
That sounds great.
or 2 weeks.
Yeah, anytime.
Great. Well, great. Thank you, Doctor. And I continue to love the lighting fixtures that you chose. They just hang perfectly behind you.
Yeah, you bet.
They look like wonderful earrings hanging off sides of your head. So, all right. Thanks, Doctor. And
Okay.
we'll see y'all live again in about a week and a half.
Great. Be well.
Right on. You too. Thanks.